Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Especially if you're hoping for some coverage of Mantra and Sinergia Games' side-scrolling Metroidvania, Elderand. Join me as I maraud its macabre lands in search of answers. Namely, did this game wind up feeling a bit flat, or was this an Elder I wound up respecting? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. It started simply, with the appearance of the charismatic outsider, Amon. His honeyed words proved seductive, coaxing the gradual emergence of the cult. As the fervor spread like a virus, Elderand's nation quaked, its society buckling beneath the weight of the Black Church's blasphemous rituals and the citizens' attempt at outrunning them. A descent into deathly decadence that saw only a scant pocket of survivors doing their best to survive in the midst of that insanity. Until the stranger arrived. The sole survivor of a terrible shipwreck, and ultimately, a mercenary on a mission. One that puts him at ends with the cult and sees him embroiled in the conflict. Though perhaps things aren't that simple. His motivation's more than the glint of gold. Admittedly, while parts of this are introduced in Elderand's opening cutscene, it does take a bit of time before the storytelling really picks up, since the first while will consist of you navigating a cave system and trying to figure out where you're supposed to go. That said, it's not devoid of narrative from that point onwards, it's just a very slow burn, since a lot of the insight you'll get for a time will be from the scattered lore entries you can find, which help to fill in some of the backstory on the land, its people, and the cult that inhabits it. You'll also get the opportunity to do some sightseeing. Yeah, you can get some gory details on how the cult works if you are so inclined. Still, while the storytelling is relatively subtle in how it progresses, at least initially, once you reach the hub area, you'll gain access to the bulk of the NPCs who will chat with you. While some of its flavor, there are some plot-centric details to be found here, and this also marks the point where the game starts to mix in the occasional dose of exposition to provide a bit more context. Yes, it remains a slow burn, but overall I didn't mind the execution, even if it took a substantial amount of time for me to actually figure out the core of what was actually going on. There's at least enough there that the endings feel adequate. Yes, endings plural by the way, with one of them being accessible midway through the game and the other two hinging on some exploration in a particular late game choice. Hint, maybe keep a second save file. Speaking of gameplay decisions, it's about time to tackle how Elderand fares as a Metroidvania, and at least insofar as the exploration goes, it feels true to form, tasking players with exploring a sprawling world which splinters off in any number of directions. That said, while it does lean into using mobility abilities that you unlock as a means of gating your progress, both for the main road and a number of secrets, I was legitimately surprised at just how much freedom the game offered insofar as exploration. You're more than allowed to venture deep into areas you're ill-prepared for, to see the sights, snag nifty items, and ultimately to find just enough rope to hang yourself with. Really, my only quibble insofar as the exploration component of the game is that its map feels a bit lackluster at this point. You don't have the ability to leave pins or markers on the map in order to denote whether there was a point of interest or treasure chest you'd seen but weren't able to grab. Instead, you need to rely on the map's bare-bones legend, which at best can be described as serviceable. For instance, it does mark down certain points of interest, such as areas where you can engage with the cult's black rituals, in case you want to play a few rounds of Wheel of Misfortune or chill out in a spooky church. On the other hand, if you figure out the intricacies of these rooms and get the rewards stashed away in them, the map doesn't actually update to signify it, so if your memory is terrible, there's good odds you'll have to scour the map manually in search of things you've lost. Which meant I got fairly familiar with a lot of the rooms, and I will give the game credit. It was nice to revisit some of these areas when I got more abilities. Swinging around stages like I was the bastard child of a Belmont was a lot of fun during some of my victory laps. Likewise, it was neat to discover that some chests that looked like they might require a certain ability were actually accessible without it, provided you were mindful of the stage's design and didn't mind making a few leaps of faith. In general, I felt the stage design was good and often rewarding. That said, I'd be lying if I wasn't immensely grateful for the fact that you get fast travel fairly early on, and not just because of the sheer amount of backtracking I had to do. See, the world of Elderand is just plain lethal, to the point that it won't be long until you're encountering a basic enemy that mulches your health in a couple of quick hits. Sure, there's RPG leveling, which provides stat points you can use to increase your vitality, 1 point per level, and vitality only grows your health at a low linear rate, effectively prolonging encounters, which is unfortunate given that your combat options feel very limited. Let's take the basic attack for instance. One-handed weapons, daggers, and staves all have a combo, but in practice you'll frequently only see the first or second hit on most normal enemies since your attacks lack hit stun, and a fair number of enemies attack relentlessly despite their high damage output, which is then further compounded because of the nuances of your defensive options. For instance, there's the dash dodge, shared by all weapon types, which sounds good on paper until you realize that it lacks iframes and is primarily useful for getting through stages in quick spurts or backstepping. You can turn fights into awkward, halting games of whack-a-mole, which is a bit of a problem in a game that will happily toss you into situations where you get flanked or surrounded. I say this because all enemies have contact damage, and again, it doesn't give you iframes. There is technically an item that lets the dash function how you think it would, providing those tasty bits of invulnerability needed to safely reposition yourself, but not only is it late game, it also cuts your HP down by 80%. Which brings us, by the way, to the weapon-specific options, and where things get actually a bit weirder. See, Elderand effectively has 4 types of weapons. Yes, there's a few that look different, but functionally, you have one-handed weapons, daggers, bows, and staves. Daggers, for instance, provide you an actual dodge that lets you sidestep in place for a brief sliver of iframes. While it's relatively high risk due to daggers' low range, it does provide a window to attack provided you get your timing down. Often only once, given just how fast enemies swing at you. They also scale off dex, which means if you don't mind completely ignoring vitality, you can crank your crit rate and damage with a single stat point. Bows, likewise, are dex-based, with the added bonus of range, piercing through enemies it kills, and an evasive shot that flings you back to maintain distance. It's actually got a decent identity, it just suffers from a relatively low ammo cap, and the fact that arrows are somewhat expensive to buy early on and aren't the most frequent drop. Then we get to one-handed weapons, whose whole thing is the ability to block. On its own, it's relatively unimpressive, since it prevents hit stagger, but doesn't actually reduce damage much. That said, fighting one-handed also lets you equip a shield, which not only provides a passive boost to your defense, it also completely negates the damage of a blocked attack. Provided the attack doesn't drop on you, hit you from the back, or bottom out the stamina bar and guard crush you. And I mean, you're still going to wind up in that same song and dance of swing once and defend, rinse, repeat, but it's relatively safer. Unless you failed to explore thoroughly and get the rare stamina boosters hidden around, or didn't put points into strength, since that also boosts your stamina. Still, at least they're not staves. See, staves just don't have a unique defensive option. I mean, okay, one staff has a special crystal shield ability, but most of them just rely on you kiting enemies around and plinking things at a distance, relying on you slowly replenishing mana to maintain the assault. Maybe that's why they let you have 2 armor and weapon sets you can swap between. All the same, it's a bit rough to the point that even the inclusion of sub-weapons to round out my arsenal did little to soothe the sting. Sure, it's nice to have a knife or axe to round out how I can start a fight, but they are consumables, they have a very low item cap, and they suffer the same RNG or gold cost to replenish as arrows do. And speaking of consumables, despite how vicious the game is insofar as dishing out damage, your healing options are also pretty bad, since you rely on the free healing from using save points, the heal you get when you level, or your super limited potion stock, which replenishes either vis-a-vis, you guessed it, RNG drops or crafting or merging. While there is an optional late game upgrade that lets you carry an additional 2 small and large healing potions, it is very rough early on, which is probably why I wound up having this weird epiphany. See, if healing's limited and death was already constantly looming, why not just be a glass cannon to end the encounters as quickly as possible? Dex-based items meant more damage and crit multipliers for a single point, which meant I could ramp them very quickly, even early game, and it gave me both decent ranged and melee options for the cost of 1 stat. Plus, there were some sparse health upgrades scattered about the world, so even without a single point of vitality, I could effectively double my starting HP. That still puts me in 2-shot range to a number of enemies, but it was better than nothing. Okay, in hindsight, it was sort of a dumb plan, but given I wound up frequently farming for long periods of time for potions, arrows, gold for the merchant, and then later on so I could get materials for upgrading gear, which as a note is a linear process but does help. TLDR, it somewhat worked. It's also how I discovered that the stat cap was 50, not including item modifiers, which will let you go past it. And it's not like the proverbial damage I was doing to my build was permanent, I should note. You do get a free unlimited stat reset, potentially, if you explore the final area thoroughly. But still, it really helps that whole facilitating switching up your build in order to solve certain puzzles or try out different strategies. You know, if the actual act of diving into your inventory doesn't drive you bonkers, since there's also absolutely no inventory management and everything's just crammed in there in the order of acquisition. Yes, this still cheeses me off. Anywho, that's my game-related gab out of the way, so let's move on and gossip about the graphics. And honestly, I really liked this game, whether it's the character designs for you and the NPCs, or the various creatures and their deaths. And I also do have to give credit to the attack cues. They were generally solid, though I'll admit that I found the boss's telegraphing frequently felt a bit more fair, since they provided a bit more leeway insofar as a response time to their animations and required less preemptive turtling. And speaking of turtling, I felt it was a nice detail to be able to see the shield I was equipped with as well as the weapon. Whilst the same can't be said for armor, I do appreciate what was there, as well as the effort put into ensuring that there were some memorable locales to be found within the game that helped to tell the story. Locales, I should note, that also benefited from a decent soundtrack. And I'm very grateful for this, given that I spent literal hours in some of these spots killing monsters to get the materials needed for upgrading. Word to the wise, there is a ring later that makes this faster, don't suffer like I did. In any case, that brings us to our conclusion and that pivotal question at the core of it all. Would I recommend Elderand? And honestly, having written all this out, it's a bit trickier than I initially thought. Narratively speaking, I enjoyed reading the lore, was quite fond of the storytelling built into the biomes, and the resolutions felt satisfying, including the bad ending thematically. That said, it was a bit more of a mixed bag mechanically. Now, I don't have complaints about the Metroidy exploration side of things, other than the map. Hell, even unlocking the better ending felt pretty natural by virtue of just exploring around thoroughly and soaking in the world. That said, combat was a constant sticking point for me. Enemy balance felt wildly varied, like, yes, they all hit hard, but the fact that some had such sparse telegraphing that it was just easier to turtle as they rapidly tossed out devastating attacks didn't feel good. Nor did the constant attrition of limited supplies as I was going through fairly tanky enemies. And this was further compounded whenever the game decided to throw the kitchen sink at me. Which, now that I think about it, was part of why the optional combat arena near the end of the game annoyed me so much. I mean, admittedly, the whole thing bugged me, since I kept having to restart it due to Monsters AI breaking in that location specifically and either becoming unkillable, or having their corpses refuse to despawn yet still doing contact damage, or just locking up the round after everything was dead. That said, peak irritation wasn't a bug and came in the later rounds, where it did things like toss in a pair of very large, contact-inducing giants who rapidly pounce at you like moving walls of meat, backing you into a corner while spamming attacks that go through shields, and who will also happily camp on top of you if you try to dodge with the dagger, to the point that my only real option felt like using healing items and just trading hits. that isn't only the only moment where combat just felt like this wildly chaotic mess, and just overall, fighting felt generally slow, painful, and punishing. While I am fond of this game, I feel it is despite a lot of these encounters. I'll also admit that I'm flagrantly annoyed at the inventory system, especially since a lot of the equipment feels very similar to each other, with the amount of items that actually have something unique or special about them feeling incredibly sparse, which is then made even crummier when you realize that it will take probably hours to farm some of them, and you're not really given any hints in-game as to how to acquire them. But here's the thing, I am fond of it. I still stuck nearly 17 hours into it to thoroughly get through to the end, and I can safely say if you're here to explore a neat world or to engage with a good bit of exploration, and even some novel little puzzle and platform segments or some challenging bosses, you're definitely in luck. That said, there are notable rough edges, enough so that while fairly solid, the game still ultimately falls into the fumble range. Also, to the devs, please include a bestiary. Grinding out enemies for a while to see if they have something to drop is painful, especially since it can be really hazy if they even have something you need or anything at all. It's not like you actually have an indication or way to track what drops what without checking community assets outside of the game. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, even a game to suggest I should cover, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.